Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Logos Project. In this week's episode, I am joined by Dr. Matthew Meinard to speak about Father Garrigou-Lagrange. Enjoy. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Logos Project. In today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Matthew Meinard. Dr. Meinard is a Ruthenian Catholic, a husband, a father, a seminary professor, and a translator. He received his PhD in 2017 from the Catholic University of America, and he is the translator of the works of Father Garrigou-Lagrange, or Garrigou-Lagrange. And so, Dr. Meinard, thank you for joining us and for agreeing to come on the show.
It's very great to be here. Yeah.
Awesome. So I was curious. I've listened to several of your episodes on reason and theology, and also let's see, who else was there? There was another podcast that I saw you on recently. Anyway, it doesn't matter. But you were talking about Father Lagrange. Oh yeah, The Meaning of Catholic with Timothy Flanders, and you were talking about Father Lagrange, and I've been doing some research myself recently, and came across your content, and I was like, yes, he's translating Father Garrigou, so I need him to, come and explain who this great Thomist was of the 20th century. So if you don't mind, I can just kick it off with a question, which is basically, who is Father Garrigou-Lagrange? Where and when was he born and raised?
Yeah. So, well, again, thank you for having me on. And you joined the long list of my students who accidentally call me Father, because they all have priest professors. I told them, no. It's nice to be a layman. I can cantor in the Byzantine Church and not have to deal with like the politics of chanceries,
Absolutely.
But I better watch and not get myself in trouble with my own employer for saying that. So anyway, yeah, and it's weird. I'm a Ruthenian who's done this stuff with Father Réginald Garrigou-Lagrange, and I anglicize the name right whenever I'm speaking in English. It's like Maritain, right? I'm not gonna. It's just I'm a bit of a Brit with that when I'm speaking English. Although I do say valet, I don't say valet. But so Réginald Garrigou-Lagrange, somewhat derisively known as the sacred monster of Thomism, and a somewhat overlooked figure during the period immediately after the Second Vatican Council, seen as a sort of throwback to an era of Neo-Scholasticism, as some would say, or even just, anti-modernism of the first half of the 20th century in Roman Catholicism. He's an interesting figure who spans the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century concerns of the Roman Catholic Church. And I say Roman Catholic just because the Byzantine world is different, and I'm sensitive to that as a Byzantine Catholic.
Right.
He was born in 1877 in Auch, France, to this sort of upper middle class, some minor nobility in the background of the family, He was, really just a young, intelligent man who had actually planned to go into medicine. Had gone to university to study medicine, and had a significant spiritual experience reading a book by someone whom we don't really talk about at all in English. Probably the French don't much today either. Named Ernest Hello was his name. And this book called L'Homme, it's this meditation. He was a Catholic author. It's this meditation on sort of the capacity of the human person for transcendence, is sort of from a Catholic perspective, though, not sort of from a humanist perspective, and very sweeping rhetoric and whatnot. It was what really set him on the path then to a Dominican vocation. So by age 20, he joins the novitiate. So in 1897, of the Parisian Dominicans, and goes through his novitiate and his initial studies, profession of vows. It was actually sent to the Sorbonne, the University of Paris, after his ordination at the turn of the century, like 1902 or so, for philosophical studies. And so he spends several years there studying. He's under the direction of course, the studium. Right, they send you out to the secular university, but he's in correspondence with like Father Ambrose Gardet, who would have been one of his formators when he was going through his clerical formation. So there are these wonderful letters back and forth. And there's a great letter too where he talks about this Slav who got up to talk about the French philosopher Henri Bergson,
Mm.
who was not a Slav actually at all. But it was Jacques Maritain.
Yeah.
So years later, they end up having fruitful and then a bit of falling out, kind of togetherness and semi opposition. But just sort of funny how God pulls these little worlds together. Before Maritain becomes Catholic, he's there expositing on this kind of reaction to positivism. And Garrigou runs into him. So he studies at the Sorbonne, studies philosophy. And it's the period right before the anti-modernist encyclical Pascendi Dominici Gregis.
Right.
So in Pettichord's
By Pius X, yeah.
Yeah, in Pettichord's book, The Sacred Monster of Thomism, it was one of these I think it was like 2010. There finally started to be a comfort of talking about Father Garrigou, and we'll probably come to some of the reasons why later, why people kind of got uncomfortable with him. It has nothing to do with Vichy France, although, has a little bit to do with Vichy France because everyone was mad at the conservatives, but it's mostly because of this stuff after Vatican II and some things about the Nouvelle Theologie. But anyway, Pettichord's book comes out, and it's this salvo around the same time as Father Aidan Nichols' book on him, where people in the mainstream start to feel comfortable talking about him. Well, anyway, Pettichord notes that Father Garrigou attended a lecture at which Alfred Loci, the French exegete, who gets in the crosshairs of the papacy, gives one of these famous lecture based on this famous dicta of the era and of himself that gets him in trouble, right? That Christ, Jesus preached the kingdom of God and the church came hereafter.
Yeah.
So he's there on the ground, and this is what's important. He's on the ground in the midst of this at once secular French intellectual culture, right? And then also too the problems of theological modernism even present there. So he goes back to teach at his house of studies. I don't remember if it was at Flavigny or which house in the French Dominican world, but he goes back to teach philosophy, and within a couple years is asked to take up a dogmatics chair. And so he ends up having to, there's a sense in which he's having to, autodidact himself into being a professional theologian as a teacher. I mean, he's gotten his formation in the priesthood, right? But he draws on the riches of the Thomist school and ends up being recognized pretty quickly for his acumen and is taken to the Angelicum, right? The Pontifical University of St. Thomas Aquinas in Rome, where he teaches then from 1909 all the way until 1960. Teaches a mixture of some philosophy, especially metaphysics, and then a sequence on Revelation for a while, and spiritual theology sequence, which goes almost the whole of that time, which gave rise to the book that maybe some of your listeners know of, the Three Ages. Yeah.
No, before you keep going, because this is absolutely fascinating, you're kind of touching on the cultural milieu of Father Lagrange. You mentioned positivism and Bergson, and so this is when Jacques Maritain had heard Bergson lecture, right? And when him and his wife, is it Raisa?
Yeah, Raisa
decided not to commit suicide, and that's when they meet with Father Lagrange.
Yeah, it's
or they encounter him.
Right around there. It's sort of before their conversion, I think, is where it would fit in the chronology.
Okay,
but they don't meet so much as Garrigou-Lagrange is at some gathering, right? Maybe it's post lecture. I forget the exact details.
I see.
Because he writes back to Ambrose Gardet, and he tells this story, and they eventually, I guess maybe later when he's friends with Maritain, people connect the dots.
Yeah.
That the person he was talking about, or maybe even he sort of encounters Maritain's writing, and Maritain ends up writing very much in a vein of Thomism that is plugged into the Dominican tradition, the Dominican commentators. And so,
as opposed to the Jesuits,
okay. Or even the sort of neo-scholastics who kind of went back to read St. Thomas's works, but they didn't engage in that long multi-century discussion that the Dominicans did.
I see.
And just because of a couple of happenstances of spiritual directors, Maritain gets plugged into basically the same formation of Thomism that would have been of influence on Garrigou and Dominicans of that era.
I see.
And so, then Garrigou says, wait, this guy who's writing this stuff in defense of Thomism is that guy I saw so many years ago.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
yeah,
that's this yeah. Which is also interesting too. So Bergson, just maybe for listeners who aren't so plugged into this is a real problem I have, because I just get so excited. I'm like,
yeah, yeah,
I live in Appalachia, which I love. It's my home place, but I don't get to talk about this stuff that
yeah.
often in my day to day. It keeps me very real and grounded, I guess. But Bergson was what was known as a vitalist of sorts. He's most famously, I think, known, when people do know of him, of his work, Creative Intuition, or not. That's gosh, I've like combined two different themes. Creative evolution.
Mm.
If you imagine an idea of the world where everything is evolving,
Mm-hmm.
and our knowledge at best is a kind of tool for us to kind of harness our moment in evolution, as just you have the upsurge of just this elan of kind of feels like the progressivism before World War One, right? That on the whole, reality is creative and open to new things, that moves, and our kind of role is just to grasp it.
Yeah,
And that's the best what our knowledge is too. Then he has a whole theory of knowledge that's around this, that's very pragmatic.
yeah,
Well, that's at least way more inspiring than positivism, a kind of scientism that's just going to turn philosophy into a kind of analysis of sense data. It kind of reduces philosophy to a kind of scientism. And so Maritain, but many French intellectuals of the period, were taken by Bergsonianism
mm.
in different ways. Maritain realizes when he becomes a Catholic, you can't be a Bergsonian and hold that there are dogmas that don't change.
Dogmas. Yeah, yeah,
And this is also the reason why, until he's an old man, Garrigou keeps writing against Bergson, because that was his experience early on, was with
with Alfred Loci as
Bergsonianism,
well, right?
with
Yeah.
Loci, exactly. So writing against the modernist era, that's very formative for him. Right before
Yeah.
he goes to um, Rome, he's writing his first book. Well, maybe it is his second book, but Sens Commun, which was published. My translation of that was Thomistic Common Sense, is what we called it.
Okay.
But that book is really, it's just in the heat of the modernist crisis, is what it's in the midst of, and the problem of development of dogma, and the possibility of knowing God's existence as a kind of problem theologically, of even having like a rational account whatsoever of things theological. Not to reduce, he's very sensitive to not reduce faith to reason, of course, but to acknowledge the stability of our dogmas, because of a realist view of the intellect.
Right.
So
Right.
that's in the back of his mind for forever. So like later when we talk about the Nouvelle Theologie, that's the background that keeps kicking in his mind.
Yeah.
So he teaches it in Rome. I mean, he's very influential. He directs many dissertations. He's only a consultator at the CDA, well, the Holy Office, much later. I think it's late in his life he becomes a consultator, but he's involved in the naming of John of the Cross a doctor of the Church,
Oh, really?
and that's part of. Yeah, I think he was a consultator for that.
Oh.
Um,
Okay.
Probably was a consultator as well, if I recall. Regarding also the Assumption, I would think.
Oh, wow.
But
I didn't
definitely
know
the
that. Yeah.
John of the Cross. I mean, he's writing at the
Yeah.
time stuff of the
Yeah.
Assumption, but yeah. So anyway, that's just giving you an idea. He's very active, influential in the Dominican order. Writes a ton. We'll eventually probably talk about all that. So that gives kind of it's like a background, maybe even into the next thing you're going to want to talk about. Anyway, that's kind of got quickly out of his childhood into his
Yeah.
life as a Dominican.
No, that's great. That's great. That's great. Yeah, I have a lot of questions. I mean, so that's really interesting about Saint John of the Cross, how he was influential in having him declared as a doctor, because I'm sure. So I wanted to ask you about not only his works, especially his mystical theology, but also maybe his students, and what I'm curious about, because I don't know enough about Father Lagrange. I've read a little bit of him like in high school, and I want to get back into him. But I did read John Paul II's Theology of the Body, and it's very phenomenological, personalistic, but also it there seems to be like some really sound principles of realism and Thomistic metaphysics, but also and I know he loved St. John of the Cross. So I guess my question is, was Father Lagrange's synthesis, his kind of spiritual metaphysical synthesis, influential on John Paul II's theology, specifically his theology of the body?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting. I've never actually thought of it in the context of theology of the body. So John Paul II, of course, is a student of his. I've gotten.
Yeah,
You almost get away from saying that, not because of anything, not because of like all the wars in the Catholic world, right? There's like
yeah,
poor Saint John Paul II has fallen on hard times in certain circles.
hmm,
But it's more just because there was a period where that's the only thing everybody said.
right,
So I kind of like took him off my list. I'd be like, yeah, okay, he directed John Paul II's dissertation, move on. But yeah, he directed the theological dissertation of
okay,
John Paul II. And there's some contestation about like little things that bothered Garrigou in it, but I mean, it passed. There were some issues with the publication, but I mean, it was on mystical experience in John of the Cross, which I forget the year it was done, but it was definitely the in thing. Because around the same time, you have a more Dominican feeling dissertation that's done by because it's got things in it related to Thomism, but it's done by Marie Dominique Chenu,
yeah,
who eventually becomes a progressive at the time of the council.
yeah,
But he's doing almost something exactly the same under Garrigou. So it's probably right around that era of the. I should double check these dates. I thought about this recently. It's around the era, I bet, of the naming of him a doctor of the church.
I see.
Yeah, which is, I mean, that's interesting itself too, just to think about.
Yeah,
You sort of have John Paul II, who ends up, because of his work on Shaler, he's known more in this vein of the phenomenology, which is in the background more of his,
hmm,
like the main thrust of something like theology of the body.
yeah,
But he's actually a very good Thomist in morals, John Paul II.
yeah,
If you
yeah,
read his Person in Community, has some brilliant stuff in it. It has both sides of his brain, because you've got some really
hmm,
like Aristotelian Thomism, like very traditional in
hmm,
the Thomistic school vein stuff, next to kind of the budding Shalerian stuff. It's very different than Person and Act, which is just full-throated lectures in a phenomenological vein, it's a much harder text. It's less edited too, as part of the issue with that text. Um,
I see, I see.
so I mean, no doubt there's an influence there, right? But part of that's gonna also come from his experiences, even in formation,
Yeah,
that he would have been formed by Thomas. So I just don't want to ground all of it on Garrigou,
okay,
because that was just theology. I have to see how long he studied actually there, because these clerics would get an STD, their theological doctorate, relatively quickly.
yeah, yeah,
So you know what I mean. So maybe it was a 2-year cursus of studies, is all that it
I
was under
see.
Garrigou, and it was not just under him. He was taking whatever other courses at the Ange.
Yeah,
So, just to cite uh, the case of Chenu, but he was also the teacher of, gosh, I mean, there are lots of dissertations that float around out there. Here in the United States, some people might know, if you have more traditionalist leaning listeners, Father Fenton,
yeah,
um,
hmm,
who was the ecclesiologist at Catholic U. But also someone who no one talks about, that I kind of pound my fist on, is Emmanuel Duranzo, an OMI, who was an Italian from, I think, Naples area, who taught, though, at Catholic U in D.C. most of his life. Probably the greatest sacramental theologian the Roman Church had.
really,
Really a man of immense erudition. Everything's in Latin, though. These monographs. They're not even manuals. They're monographs. Brilliant guy. He has a brilliant dogmatics text that he did. It's really the last of the great manuals from the 60s. Um,
mm,
but then, in France, um, you have folks like, I mean, just kind of to take two lights in dogmas and morals that would be centrally important. Um, on the one hand, Jean Hervé Nicolas, who I've done some translating stuff of as well, taught at Freiburg for a number of years, and although he's definitely a man after the council, much more interested in a sort of dialogue with different schools. The bones of all of his thought are Thomistic. He wrote an in memoriam for Father Garrigou. And so like the marks of Garrigou were all over him. And then another person that I bring up a lot nowadays, because I'd like to see him somewhat not rehabilitated, because nothing was wrong with him, but appreciated, is Father Michel Labordette,
yeah,
who was a moralist who taught at the Toulouse, uh, whatever, their house of studies, uh, Saint Maximin. Um, and most of his like works on morals are actually just posthumously published from his notes. They're very extensive lecture notes. But he was the editor of the Revue Thomiste, and so was influential for a long period. And I just wish he would have some of a voice next to Father Servais Pinckaers. I don't know if you probably know Father Pinckaers. Yeah, I feel
Yes, yes.
yeah.
I heard you mention that the fact that Father Pinker is always cited for going back to the sources and being more teleological as opposed to deontological and morality. And you meant what was the name? Who did you say it was again?
Father Labordette, Michel
Father
Labordette.
Labordette's. Okay,
Yeah.
yes, yeah, Father Labordette. And you were saying Father Labordette's been talking about this
And
already, and
Garrigou
so that got me
and
curious.
Garrigou-Lagrange does as well. So this is another example. So Father Pinckaers, who's a Freiburg moralist who teaches there in Switzerland
Yeah,
for a number of years and influenced a number of folks who are teachers today.
yeah. I
He
really enjoyed what he wrote. Yeah,
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 no, and he writes. It's kind of like Etienne Gilson. He's a good narrative writer,
yeah.
right? And narrative is easier to digest.
That's
And
right. Yeah,
there's something good about especially the desire to sort of reground morals in its theological context.
right.
But so
Hmm.
I'm not saying this is at all lifted. I really am not. I used to kind of suspect that just because I was angry at the world. But Father Pinker studied in Rome during the time Garrigou was there. Garrigou was lamenting in the 30s
Oh,
the legalism, the deontology, all of that. I mean, really stuff
yeah.
that really echoes the themes in Father Pinker's, and that's where I started to realize.
Interesting.
I'm sure I don't know your story in Catholicism, but we've all had a bit of this feeling in our lives that everything we've been told is lies, and that's a little strong, right? But there's that 19, 20, 21-year old, 22-year-old anger at
Yeah.
nothing has been told to me that's true. Well, when I read that, I thought, wait a second, all of the
Hmm.
legalism and morals, all the kind of discussion of the centrality of beatitude and the gifts of the Holy Spirit
Hmm.
and virtues, this is all, wait a second, it sounds like exactly the same in Garrigou.
Yeah.
And I mean, you do start digging down and you see that the Dominicans really had this rich tradition
Yeah.
from the turn of the century, trying to really refound the theological character of moral theology. And get it away from this idea of just precepts and commandments and
Hmm.
cases of conscience and things of that sort.
Hmm.
And so this was attributed normally to Pinker's, and you realize, oh my gosh, it's generations before him,
Hmm.
and it's a real shame not to have that kind of continuity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's some of that's some of these things that are, I guess, in the background too of this period.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
the other thing, maybe if I may make a remark just about the theological milieu that's important to remember as well that the old schools still sort of existed at this period, most prominently the Soretians, though, because the Jesuits
Hmm.
following the Spanish scholastic Francisco Suarez and his sort of blending of Thomism with some Scotism and his own insights was,
Oh.
kind of the reigning school of the Jesuits. I mean, there were Jesuits who were trying to be pure Thomists. Cardinal,
Hmm.
he lost his cardinalship at the end of his life, but Bo is a good example of someone who was doing Thomism of a sort, but on his own. He wasn't reading. He was actually quite against the Dominican commentators, but he was trying to not be a follower of Suarez. But the order was pretty powerfully Suarezian. There were some latter-day Scotists, if you will, followers of Blessed John Duns Scotus. They're always a bit more ragtag, A, because they're Franciscans, because that's just the way of Franciscans,
Yeah.
and B, because Scotus, he died before his works were ever in good form, so it's not as unified a body.
Right.
But there were some really great Scotists. Father Balich, who was a great Mariologist, but was involved in getting critical editions of Scotus's works, was very active during this period of Garrigou's activity. And he actually, Father Balich, was the person who wrote the schema, I believe. He was powerfully involved, or maybe I'm just thinking of how much he cited for the schema on the Blessed Virgin Mary that eventually kind of got rejected, right? It got stuck into Lumen Gentium.
That's right.
The Easterners wanted it. The Easterners wanted it to be on its own.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a whole different topic that I can get angry at. You can read people like Yves Congar, the
Yeah.
progressives. They loved using the Easterners because of certain ecclesiological things we want. We don't want the centralized ecclesiology, but they got mad at us for that. We
Yeah.
were embarrassing in front of the Protestants to them.
Yeah.
So, but the point is, you have kind of the activity of not merely just sort of a neo-scholastic block,
Hmm.
right? Like everyone's talking about the same things. You have within the West, the various competing schools. but everyone is kind of trying to find their way forward in a modern
Yeah.
context that's post-revolution,
Mm-hmm.
and trying to find a kind of basis for a kind of Christian Catholic philosophical and theological answer to modernity.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's the problem that kind of that unites the middle of the 19th century all the way to Vatican II,
Yeah.
is that real, so there's a sense of, it's not panic, that's the wrong way to put it because that makes it sound too helter skelter,
Yeah.
but like it's groping, trying to figure out
Yeah.
how to deal with the problem
Yeah.
that is modernity. Yeah, so that's, sorry, all over the place, but there you have it.
No, that's no. This is great stuff. This is great stuff. So, let's see. Going back a little bit to Father Lagrange's theology. So, could you maybe talk a little bit about his works? What was he best at? What's his legacy? Like, what can we really learn from in his
Yeah,
works?
yeah, so what was he best at? I'd say the things he's best at, let's put him on three headers. um there's a sense in which he's the last of the commentators. Eh, I say that, but like I used to say, but Father Ramirez, also in Spain, is actually maybe a greater commentator in some ways. But that being said, so you have a series of works that come out of his teaching, right? He must have had to teach the sequence of the Summa, because that would sort of be a normal way. The Dominicans would kind of take just the text of the treatises of the Summa and teach them, and then reference the older school and the kind of debates that happened on different topics as you go along, and then update the debate about certain things that are more contemporary. And so if you read On the One God, or the Trinity and Creator, or Beatitude, although I have to say this every time I talk publicly, the Beatitude translation is a paraphrase. I'm very kind to translators because translating is underappreciated and very difficult. But it is a paraphrase. It's actually kind of problematic. But the Theological Virtues volume, the volume on Christ, all of those are they're commentaries. They're not manuals in the sense of, you kind of have like a listing of all the theological topics, the various schools, and then here are your theses to hold. That's sort of a genre that existed for teaching in the seminaries, somewhat maligned because it's a textbook and people want to kind of just dump on them. But even Garrigou himself noted that it has its limits because it's just a kind of like teaching text. But these are kind of commentary mode, right? So what he's doing is he's taking a close reading of Thomas in view of the tradition of the Dominicans. Very conservative mode of writing. Very conservative mode of writing, in the sense that it's kind of taking the pre-accepted texts and commenting on commentators. But that's a way that a tradition lives, is by doing that exercise. Then there is the spiritual theology stuff. So the three ages of the spiritual life is of course the 2-volume set that folks probably know of. But then you have in this vein some of the, maybe we could call them explorations in spiritual theology. Should look at my shelf here to make sure I don't get this wrong. But with the love of God and the cross of Christ, I think I should remember the name of it. I mean, I look at it all the time. See if it comes up on my computer quickly. Yeah, the love of God and the cross of Jesus. Yeah, and also too his work on, oh my gosh, but it's the work on the spiritual theology of John of the Cross and Saint Thomas, Christian perfection and contemplation. Those works, along with a couple little minor works, and there's some very good entree to him as Knowing the Love of God. It's a retreat set that he gave. It's a nice little summary of a lot of those themes. Those lay out a kind of integrated spiritual theology that's in line with St. Thomas, but quite well versed in the broader tradition of ascetical authors and especially later mystics. So you'll get some stuff from the Rhineland mystics, pretty powerfully synthesized though with the Carmelites in particular. Part of the reason for that is, of course, it's the coin of the realm of the day, right? So in a sense, he's just being a son of the church who's sort of taking the directions from where things are with the naming of John of the Cross Doctor. But the Dominicans and Carmelites also had a sort of close wedding because of the Carmelites of Salamanca,
The Carmelites,
who commented.
yeah, that when
Yeah,
their formation was Saint Thomas, correct?
Yeah, and so at
Okay,
least
okay,
I mean, it was a pretty mainstream line to be, and some of them rather traditionally Thomist. And
okay.
so the Carmelites, the line that comes out of the Carmelites of Salamanca in the 17th century becomes part of the normal commentators. Like so, you're reading all these OP commentators, but then there's the 20-volume set that they do that comes out, and then you have, as spiritual theology develops as a separate branch within theology, so it's a sort of reflection in theology on mysticism, states of mysticism, the relationship of passive mysticism to the activity of prayer and meditation, all those sorts of questions that come up. That there are a number of figures among the Carmelites who, though, are pretty straight line Thomists that the Dominicans would consider, sort of in their tradition of commenting and thought.
I see.
So that world is actually, there's a sense in which Father Garrigou is doing something, though, that's on his own there. He's even
Yeah,
been recognized pretty recently in some of the French literature. Is that's the, for lack of better terms, the more progressive side of him,
yeah.
in the sense that he's synthesizing,
Mm,
he's synthesizing the mystical tradition with Thomism,
mhm.
and there he shows himself really to be quite an able moral theologian as well as the spiritual theologian. Um,
I see.
some of that stuff is some of it's difficult and dry
Yeah.
to the non-expert, but once you get into the warp and woof of a certain genre of writing that is kind of scholastic in its bent, it's profound stuff. Profound stuff. Um, so he's not unique in doing that. I've mentioned figures in other talks: Juan Arentero, Ambrose Gardet. These are people who influenced him. But still, it's kind of the unique synthesis, a Garrigouvian synthesis. So it's different than the commentator. I mean, the commentator tells you something about him. How did he conservatively digest the theological tradition of Thomism? Okay, so there we've got two Garrigous, and there are offshoots, right? But like, say, writes a Mariology volume and things of this sort. But I'm trying to get kind of the big
Yeah.
bones here. Um, the other Garrigou is actually the philosopher. Now, there's going to be it's with the caveat here in a second, but there are a number of books like God, his existence and his nature, or yeah, the 2-volume set is a quite powerful. It's dated because it's the philosophers he's writing against are turn of the century, right? So who's talking about Herbert Spencer nowadays, right? But Spencer was the coin of the realm at that time, kind of, I mean, very popular actually.
Hmm.
But in a way, philosophical errors are the same. So it's just as current today. If you get beyond who he's talking about, people make the same mistakes today as they did, right, all the way back to the Epicureans, and before, all the way back to the pre-Socratics. Right, our current world is nothing more than Heraclitus. But that 2-volume work is a
Yeah.
natural theology, sort of the metaphysics of how we can know God's existence, what we can say of Him, a defense of the very possibility of that, viewed with a very theologically erudite lens, but in the vein of a philosophical work on the whole. I mean, it's a good example of actually what he thought of Christian philosophy, right? That there's a sense in which
Mm.
Christian faith influences our philosophy without, however, turning it into theology. And he takes a position even on that's kind of close to what Gilson takes, actually. And
Oh, I was gonna say,
Maritain.
isn't that what Maritain? Yeah,
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 he
that's
does.
yeah.
He actually publicly does. There's an essay he writes. He gives a paper in Latin
Okay,
where he's clearly in line with them. I mean, he even clearly himself states it, especially
okay.
Maritain. He directly
Interesting.
that uses Maritain's own schema
Yeah.
on the Christian philosophy bit. But it's a great example of how a Christian philosophy would be done. It's a very powerful treatment. So just to choose one topic, because it's the one that I end up using a lot teaching, because we do stuff on Saint Gregory Palamas, because we're a
Mm.
Byzantine seminary.
Yeah.
But when we get to some of the stuff in Pseudo Dionysius and Saint Gregory Palamas about divine simplicity and the names of God, to present them at least with a counterfoil, I outline. I don't really use the text because it's too technical, but I outline the position on the divine names. How do we use multiple different names of God that are only conceptually distinct, but they're not confusable? So we've got all these different names we use of God, and how do the Thomists talk about it? And there's just a brilliant treatment of that. There's actually an incredible treatment of freedom in that volume,
Really?
because he's dealing with the problem of God's freedom to create,
Yeah.
but it ends up becoming this really powerful bit that Maritain picks up on and uses quite significantly. And I always cite back to it.
Interesting.
So it's, just for instance, he's very deeply appreciative of the fact that when we make moral choices, even though technically, yes, there's a kind of primacy that our minds have or our intellects have, knowing, right? We don't just will things into existence. We don't make right by just because it's, how we feel or what our will is.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, coming to a final decision is profoundly dependent on the fact that we have to be virtuous.
Yeah.
Right? That if you don't have a virtuous will, you won't actually make the decision that you need to make. And so there's a way that the intellect and the will interact very closely.
Yeah.
And he analyzes it just profoundly in there. So he shows, the point in my remarks is he shows its philosophical chops. A couple of the other works I did, translations of, were in this vein, because as I was waiting for my dissertation to sort of be finished, you go through these periods where you send chapters and people take forever to get back to you. I started reading The Sense of Mystery, The Sense du Mystère, and it's this meditation on the need for a sense of mystery for the philosopher and the theologian. It's a powerful way of showing that Thomism is not merely just boring textbook stuff, right? So
Yeah.
I thought, this is great. I'm going to translate it. I mean, what a foolishness. I had kind of researcher's French. I mean, my French wasn't bad, but I'm a kid from Appalachia, so I mean, I didn't have the benefit to go live abroad, right? I could read French, and so I decided to translate a whole book as my first go. So yeah. Anyway, so I did that, and I started to realize there's all this other philosophical stuff by him that's not been translated, and it's probably because it's philosophical. Philosophy is always kind of like, you tell people, oh, you teach philosophy. They're like, oh, you do theology. That's like what they think.
Yeah.
They don't have a category for it. So he has a book on finality, like the principle of finality. All things act for an end. And so it's a little bit of a pastiche, as Yves Simon joked, because it's a bunch of articles he wrote on the topic. But it's, about the importance of teleology. And it's a, very deeply learned philosophical meditation on it. And the same thing is that Sens Commune that I mentioned, is a book that's kind of a philosopher dealing with the problem of theological modernism, right? He's informed as a theologian. In the later editions, when he kind of reorders the text, the third section on dogmatic development is a theological section. So it's theological, but it's incredibly philosophical in the first parts. He has a whole host of these articles, though, I found as I was doing stuff. So I actually put together a volume that Clooney Press did that's just made up of all these purely philosophical articles that he did. And then in some ways, it's sort of his most unique work, although he is pretty deeply indebted to Cardinal Tommaso Zigliara in some ways. But his De Revelatione.
Oh, yeah.
Now, it's technically a theological work on divine revelation, because with the manifold errors of modern epistemology, of modern theories of knowledge, Catholic theology eventually realizes that that first question, or those first two questions of St. Thomas's Summa Theologiae and that approach to theology, are pretty short, right? Like, before you even get off the ground of talking about theological methodology, which actually grows into a whole genre called De Locis, theologicis, from something that was written by Melchior Cano. You also need to defend the possibility of revelation, right? That human reason is open to revelation, that although supernatural revelation goes beyond the powers of reason, that there's a real sense in which supernatural revelation is also naturally the most incredibly belief-worthy thing. And although, based on not only miracles and the fulfillment of prophecy, but the miraculous life of the church, the sublimity of all of the teachings of Christ taken together, like all of that leads you to a judgment to say, boy, Christianity is the loftiest of religions. Like an apologist can do that, can argue someone to that point, but only the movement of grace, of the the light of faith can then lead you to assent to truths of faith. And yet the truths of faith are also eminently the most rationally belief worthy. I mean, in the public square, there's a real place for that kind of argument on behalf of the Christian faith because it's articulated in the terms of reason. But it's done, theology has to do this defense. It's like the first step of kind of introducing theology is to do this. And sometimes you have to double back, right? Later, after doing all of theology, you revisit these topics. So he wrote massive, I can say this because I translated it and it did nearly crush my soul, 600 to 700,000 word 2-volume set that was based on his teaching when he taught that on Revelation class at the Angelicum. Very systematic, wonderful. It's a treatment of all the topics that you need to deal with in order to show the rational credibility of the Christian faith.
Yeah, this is actually really interesting because I've been reading Ratzinger like a madman recently, and I was reading about his account of his dissertation on Revelation, and the debate at Second Vatican Council over Dei Verbum. So could you say there was a confusion being made in kind of lower class, more manual Thomism between Loci theologici? Is that how you say it? Or is it Locis theologicis?
Mhm.
Um,
Oh well, de locis, yeah, locis,
the
yeah.
Locis theologici. Okay.
But it would be, but you could say in the nominative, you could say loci theologici.
Okay.
So you could just strip both
As
s's
opposed to
off too,
the genitive.
because of
Okay.
de. Yeah,
Okay.
not the genitive. It would be it's the ablative because it's in. That's fine because
Okay.
it's de
Yeah.
locis
Yeah.
theologicis. But yeah, about the loci theologici. Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay, yeah, so it seems like was there a confusion between the Loci and then Revelation itself, as Ratzinger would say, who is a person, and the order of ontology being, Revelation is kind of like, not Revelation. The Loci is kind of like a mirror to Revelation. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. So no, this is a good question. So now, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna step into the world of one of Garrigou's students. I mean,
Okay.
he knows this stuff. He cites it in the De Revelatione volume because technically you really can't finish these preliminaries without doing the De Locis, but that got covered elsewhere in the curriculum. So he kind of shuffles it off. But this is, I mean, this is both an intrinsically interesting issue, and it's also one that, especially given how you just talked, I wonder if my friend Richard Decloux has influenced your language. The order of
Yeah.
ontology. He says this. He's correct too. So yeah, there was
Yeah.
but this helps us see this, right? So what Garrigou writes on is sort of the problem of nature's openness to revelation, just nature's openness to the supernatural and how to articulate it, right?
Yeah.
Well, then, as a theologian, you have to ask yourself the question of, well, what are the sources that are deployed? What are the ways that we engage with revelation in our theological reflection? It's a very important question of methodology. How is the tradition? Eventually this all gets reduced to scripture and tradition, but there was sort of a tenfold schema where you would have scripture, tradition, the councils, because really it's like the councils are bearing witness to tradition, but in a way that is the church proposing. So it's different.
Yeah.
The fathers of the church, later theologians, the way that philosophy can be used. All of these are places where you can get your data. That's actually why it's the locis,
Yeah.
because it actually comes originally from the topics of Aristotle.
Oh.
Topos. Actually, it technically comes from the topics of Cicero, because that's what's in the background of, I forget his name, some very Germanic name, who is of influence on Rodolphus Agricola, is of influence on Melchior Cano, who writes the thing that among scholastics tends to be the De Locis layout. Like everyone kind of at least is going to be in that vein of after him talking. But so that's like it's the theological question, right? So how can I know the sources for my reflection, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it did become a temptation as the genre slowly but surely kind of whittled itself down into scripture and tradition are the loci theologici. So it kind of reduced the
Yeah.
pluriformity, right? So let's use an example.
Yeah.
Tradition is then lived in the church, in her councils, in the actions of the magisterium, in the liturgy,
Liturgy, yeah.
in the preaching and teaching of the fathers, right? There's all of these are these channels of tradition, but they're not tradition as a source of revelation, right? They involve the further elaboration of the unchanging deposit of the faith. And so it's important to have them as separate things to talk about. Well, it slowly gets whittled down to scripture and tradition. I don't know if this is completely just a kind of we're not Protestant thing. Because Kano's already post-Protestant, but sort of all the
Yeah.
anti-Protestant polemics become, we're not just,
Yeah.
how often do we hear this? We're not sola scriptura, we're scripture and tradition.
Yeah.
Well, that becomes like all that it is. And then certain vagaries, actually, because of the defense of the church and the papacy, kind of shoved all this stuff into a treatise on the church,
I see.
is actually what happened. And it got kind of lost. The treatise of the church was a mess because really it was all about defending the church and the magisterium. And it was true. When I say it's a mess in the sense that
Right.
it needed to get moved to the mystery of Christ. And this was at the turn of the 20th century. Even Garrigou notes this, and I don't know who influenced him on this. He's like, you got to move this stuff, but because of the curriculum, we're doing it in the wrong place.
I see.
So, okay, now let's step back and ask about Revelation. It became really normal to talk about Revelation as having two sources. You're right, that scripture and tradition, they're these sort of separate things, sort of outside, kind of running parallel to each other.
Yeah.
And I mean, as a phenomenon, this is going to be somewhat true. Like, let's just take an example of it isn't, because we have scriptural bases for everything. This is that whole debate over the material containment of exactly.
Yeah.
But like think of the early ritual living out of the tradition of orders. It's reflected in scripture, but there are elements of the revealed truth that are in the actual like institution of orders as a sacrament. So tradition has its sort of, for lack of better terms, life separate from scripture. But you get into all kinds of insoluble problems when you're trying to kind of relate them to each other then, because they be these two separate streams.
Yeah.
And really the ancient church's view of this, and now we're talking more Ratzinger, this is not Garrigou, but Garrigou's student Duranzo, after the council, in his little book on he has a series of these little books that he kind of partially translates out of his dogmatic theology and that he adds to it. He accepts the council pretty openly on this. He says, it's fine. It's fine because what you have is, the ancient theme that Christ is the fullness of revelation, right? And then you see all of scripture and tradition are lived in the mystical body.
Yeah.
Right. And it kind of helps you get over them being oil and water outside of each other. You then start to see how scripture interprets tradition and vice versa.
I see.
But, I think it's interesting then to notice, though, that someone who was, Garrigou wrote a couple of intros for Duranzo for his sacraments texts.
Mm-hmm.
It's a nice thing about writing in Latin, right? Your teacher in Rome he can write the Latin intro. And he wrote some very warm reviews of them, too, in French. But a Garrigouvian was not some, kind of, I'm not really trying to be polemical, but I think it's very important in this age to call out a kind of angry traditionalism. In many ways, I myself am a very traditional Catholic, even as a Ruthenian, and even as regards liturgy, quite traditional. But a kind of everything that could have come out that's not in an idiom of a very limited view of what theology is. Like, to talk about Revelation in this way is essentially modernistic. Well, someone who was a very conservative but good sacramental theologian was comfortable with this stuff, and I think it should at least lower our blood pressure a little bit that a Garrigouvian could be that comfortable with it.
Yeah.
Nicolas Labordette are other good examples that even though they're more progressive maybe by bent than Garrigou, they're still very faithful. They're conservative compared to so much other stuff. They were comfortable with interacting with these new things. And I think that reflects the fact that Garrigou, even in his anti-modernism, right, even in his work in Sens Commune, is thinking for himself, right? In those genres of the philosophy and the borders of faith and reason, apologetic theology or de revelatione, and spiritual theology, he's not merely holding the line. He really, there are other nuggets I could come up with where he says stuff that, like, the implications of it, they don't destroy Thomism or anything, but they kind of carry it another step forward. because he's just doing honest philosophy and honest theology. And Maritain recognized him for this.
Yeah.
Late in his life, he like listed 3 books like you should get to read, and one of which was the German Foresight book. Oh my goodness, I'll remember his name now later. I should remember it, but the German Jesuit. But Gilson's lectures on Christian philosophy, the spirit of medieval philosophy, and Sens Commun, because Maritain says these books aren't merely, Father Gret, his great manual. He says it was a great manual, but it was like an aerolite that fell from heaven. All the answers were written on it, and we just had to look it up. And it was great. It was very erudite, but it didn't have the honesty of someone working through a problem. Like, right? It wasn't dishonest, but it didn't have that kind of like, here's an active mind facing the problems of today. And he names this anti-modernist text. It's like 1968. He names an anti-modernist text as this honest philosophical account of Thomism.
Interesting.
So, and I think it's important to see that in Garrigou.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm going to get in trouble someday, but it's like, I try to like emphasize that like there's a reason Maritain loved Garrigou. Garrigou is not just stodgy.
Yes, this is actually a perfect segue into one of my questions. It might be too big of a question, so feel free to just wave it aside. But the question is, Father Lagrange and Jacques Maritain had political disagreements.
Mm-hmm.
What were they on? I'm actually genuinely curious about. I'm not sure what the debate was.
Political disagreements started practically over the issues of Franco and Spain. Is where it started.
Okay.
Yeah, and Maritain wrote a couple of essays that I forget who he was going to publish them with, even, that the episcopate told him not to publish, and so he didn't. You can find them in his collected works, but
okay,
yeah. And then slowly but surely, it's like sort of around the same period, because it's in 1937, I think, that Maritain goes to South America to give the lectures that are now known as integral humanism. That certain claims around the church-state relationship he weakens, right? I mean, someone summarized it well as like this: Christendom is an analogical concept, so Christendom today can't look like the Christendom of old. I mean, that's like that's like a real like text, like shortened version of Maritain's.
It's a little bit of a Augustine argument. City of God type of idea.
Yeah, well, no, there's a sense in which it is, because my mind goes different ways here. It's there's. It's a mixture of city of God, like a separation of the real ability of the church to be active in politics, with a bit though, just a sprinkling though of liberal modernity, and the experience of World War II, and the Vichy government, and him being in America probably does, and then his work whenever he's an ambassador for the Vatican and he's involved with the UN.
I see.
It injects a little bit more of a kind of secular view of the distinction between, or separation of church and state. It's not quite like John Courtney Murray in its lineament, but it echoes that. And so then there start to be controversies, not only about sort of these practical issues of Spain and Vichy France, which that also is an issue. The Vichy stuff is a problem.
Yeah.
Everyone likes to say that the conservatives were, kind of blithely not paying attention to the Nazis. And I mean, there were some problems later on, but everyone was pro Vichy. Not everyone, but lots of people were pro Vichy till they weren't, because people got swept up in it. Conservative Catholics as a whole remembered what the secular government did, and so you had a war hero from World War I put in power, Maréchal Pétain, who the Hitler government puts into power. So, trying to understand without saying it was fine, but trying to understand in its historical context this, you can see how people get tied up and pulled into a kind of,
right.
We're going to at least restore pre-Republican France.
Catholic
I think it's very important to search our own souls and ask, it's like Jordan Peterson talks about, how was it that a bunch of regular people became Nazi collaborators? Okay. Now, eventually, though, first of all, Garrigou is very clear. He backs the papacy from Brenner and Sorga onward, against the Hitlerian government. So, he's living in Rome and, is sort of separate from all of that. And clearly, as things go on, then everyone who has an ounce of moral sees what's going on with the Hitler government, and then it's just a question of how much are you involved with the resistance. But there's bad blood, nonetheless. There's bad blood involved with that. There's also, I might as well go there. You said I can talk unless you want to cut me off. Some of this goes back into the 20s too, whenever l'Action Française gets condemned. So the Action Française was this monarchist movement that was primarily secular, but used the idea of the church as kind of a binding force for what it means to be French. So in a sense, France's destiny is tied up with the church. But Charles Maurras was not himself, believer. And eventually, because of this vein of kind of subordinating religion to the state, in a sense, actually, um, you run into this in certain non-believing political philosophers too, right? Right. Religion is important for the state, but it's not because it's intrinsically true. The papacy finds itself under Pius XI the need to condemn it. This is where Cardinal Biot, or some people would say Bilot, loses his hat because he has a huge fight with the Pope, and he retires. The great Jesuit theologian at the
I
Greg.
was reading about that in Lefebvre's biography that I'm reading
Mhm.
right now. Yeah,
Yeah, it was
that comes up, the whole Action Française.
it was huge. So that really split the French conservatives as well. Garrigou writes an article like you wouldn't know what he's even talking about. Like it's in support of the papacy, but he won't say it directly. It's in the Philosophizing in Faith volume. Like
Really?
if you read it, he's like at the end he says, and if there were a movement that has so many things that could be promising, that could just purify itself of this, but he doesn't say it directly.
That is typically French. Oh yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
And but that whole problem then has already primed a set of fights that then leads to the bad blood with the stuff in Spain, which then is going to be exacerbated with World War II, which then is going to be somewhat exacerbated within the claims that Maritain is falling into a kind of liberal view of the relationships of church and state. Garrigou actually, though, he does try to pump the brakes in certain places on behalf of Maritain. There were some authors that wrote
yeah,
against Maritain, and he defends him in the sense of saying you're making too broad of claims against him. He cites
yeah.
the Person in the Common Good articles in the 40s
Hmm.
in the Beatitude volume. It's you can see it in the Latin, at least. I don't think it made it into that paraphrastic translation. So it's a mixed bag. Garrigou gets his political philosophy and the idea of how you distinguish personality and individuality and what that means for politics from his own teacher, Marie Benoit Schwalm, who Maritain uses. So while Garrigou remains a bit more in the sort of older integralist language of the social doctrines of the church of that period. You see this at the end of De Revelatione, right? At the end of talking about Revelation, there's a big 30,000 word chapter on the duty of the state to receive sufficiently proposed revelation. It's a very good summary. It's actually a very good and just level-headed presentation of that, actually. And so that's just this distance. Yeah, that's what sort of ends up separating them. It's tragic. There's a bit of like back and forth through Charles Journet, where it's like they can't talk to each other, but it's like, how is he doing? Sort of things.
Oh my goodness.
um, so anyway, that's your answer. I mean, Maritain says at the end of his life, he prays to Garrigou as though he's a saint.
Wow,
The
that's
Garrigou
wonderful.
accepted the suffering of his last days. I forget if it was Lavaud or someone, one of Garrigou's younger students, was with him, and as his faculty started to go, he was aware of it, and he accepted the suffering, and it was not insignificant. And yeah, Maritain kind of keeps the notes of that era. He says, it was, I'm not going to doctor these up and make the 1930s sound kumbaya. We were disagreeing. I was
Yeah,
profoundly angry at him, but I do want to make a note for the man who was of immense influence on me. Yeah.
yeah. This is super helpful. I mean, I was reading again, and this is why I want to read more Thomist commentators, because I've been focusing a lot of time on Ratzinger. And so I have a few questions about that. But let's just say I was reading Ratzinger. I think it was Principles of Catholic Theology towards the end. He talks about how there really is a change in the church, but also in liberalism. And this is kind of what you're talking about with the fact that America is, a kind of liberal system that's
Mm-hmm.
no longer like as anti-Catholic as France was.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
France's liberalism was defined almost by its anti-Catholicism. So that was just incompatible, especially like Leo the 13th, who himself being French, and it just
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
that's just, yeah, incompatible, no go. So liberalism is a sin. I'm thinking of Lefebvre and stuff like that. I think he wrote that. And but with Maritain in the United States, he's seeing, well, wait a minute, there might be a kind of way of coexisting in a neo-pagan liberal world that is not antithetical to the church.
Yeah.
Yeah, so is that kind of the
Yeah.
difference here between
It
Lagrange and
is. It is. No,
Maritain?
there are open questions. I just finished rereading Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed. 'Cause I'm teaching a political philosophy course this semester or this summer. There's an honest question that can be asked. Well, was it still too hopeful? Right? Did
Yeah,
the U.S. was in some ways Burkean in practice, but liberal still in the end in its philosophy. And so it just took time for that to sort of work itself out, that kind of the ultimate ideas of the human person, um
yeah,
that liberalism posits about us as individuals related to transcendent
yeah,
truths, etc. But if you're a Frenchman who sort of is thinking in the vein of the experience of French laicity, the lay state in France. Then you look at America. Yeah, it's going to at least lead you to ask: is there a kind of middle way that can be taken here?
yeah,
And while one can recognize this as being, perhaps somewhat wrongheaded. I mean, Maritain remains in many ways my great master, actually. Um, but I question some of that stuff in his political thought. But I don't
yeah,
see the reason to lose my mind because
right,
how many folks did kind of fall into that.
yeah,
And I think of my own ritual church's experience, and even when I was Roman Catholic, actually, I was a Slavic Roman Catholic.
hmm,
So many of my ancestors were very tied up with the American experience because it wasn't what they experienced in the old country.
yeah,
In their case, the persecution, whether it be Bolshevik, or even just kind of a suppression of Greek Catholicism by the Orthodox. They're very American. Like the GCU, the Greek Catholic Union, when they meet, they both pray. They pray. I think whatever, if they pray the Heavenly King Comforter or whatever they pray, and then the pledge of the flag. I'm just with kids. I'm not a member of it right now. I just don't kind of have time with the little kids. But we sometimes are there when they have meetings after our church gatherings. And, they do a pledge of the flag, and it feels like you're a kid in school. Which I don't even know if they do it anymore. But that indicates like they came here and saw a kind of relationship of religion and the state that was different, that went deep to their hearts, so much so that it's still today echoing. So like the same thing for him, and I think it just you should bear that in mind.
no,
And I'm not
absolutely, yeah,
sanguine on the American stuff because
yeah,
it's so Anglo-Irish
yeah,
in its Catholic side that I don't get
yeah,
like weepy eyed about that, but this is my nation, and
yeah, yeah,
so I'm not, of course, in that sort of vein of like let's inveigh against America, but I think that people saw that as
yeah.
maybe a possibility. But boy, late liberalism is showing its teeth in a way that's not too encouraging.
Yeah, I mean, now there seems to be a kind of rise, especially in some Catholic circles, of this post-liberal movement,
Hmm.
and I think, I mean, it seems very promising. I don't know enough about all. I mean, like DC Schindler is
Hmm.
kind of one of the pioneers in political philosophy theology, um, but also, I mean, there's other kind of think tanks here and there, and it seems very interesting. I'm wondering where it'll go eventually, but
Yeah, and I think there were resources in the discussions that were had. Like you've got, the stuff that whole period of L'action Française is actually interesting to go back to read. There are a couple of interesting things that Garrigou wrote in that Philosophizing the Faith volume I put together. But then to reread Maritain's Primacy of the Spiritual, to read Journet's l'exigence, the requirements of Christianity in political matters or something like that. But it's a huge, it's like 900 pages in French. And then the other stuff too, though, to reread BO. I'm actually using BO's liberalism volume as part of the critique of liberal modernity in my political philosophy class, because I think we need to engage with it. It's too new, but I would normally, if I had a year or two to kind of digest it and see where it falls out, Adrian Vermeule's new book on common good constitutionalism. While I have my reservations about some of this because we're just headlong running into a kind of reaction, Deneen himself actually says we don't need another ideology.
Mm-hmm.
We actually need to just practice governance at a local level.
Mm.
We don't need to answer the ideological errors
Yeah.
of modernity with yet another ideology.
Mm-hmm.
They're very interesting things. And
Yeah.
and I think that engaging with some of these issues where they came up, like in Garrigou, and those who were back and forth with him, is interesting. Have you read the Danielou book on prayer as a political problem?
No, but I want to.
It's a fascinatingly, it's short too, so it's pretty easy.
Okay.
It's a fascinatingly conflicted volume.
Really interesting.
Because it's at once, a pro religious liberty and a kind of, there's almost like it's like a 3/4 throat, maybe not full throated, but 3/4 throat that.
Yeah.
But he opens with the idea that Christianity, because it's not a religion of the elite, needs Christendom, calls for Christendom, and that's ahistorical to say that it's not. So it's this very conflicted mixture of things that are very traditional, and then so I think these are all quite interesting, and it's all related to this stuff with Garrigou. So for your listeners who are like, this is now just descended into whatever Dr. Meinrad wants to talk about, maybe we can go back to.
No, this is great. No, this is great. But that's also another thing, is that because of the bitter disputes that took place, a lot of these writers have been just kind of left on the wayside and ignored. When they, like you said, they might have something to offer that, we're looking at these other authors. Mm-hmm. What about these guys? So bringing them both together, kind of rapprochement. Yeah. So let's see, we are at 1 hour and 5 minutes. This is honestly a fascinating conversation. I have a couple more questions, unless you have to go.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah, luckily we took yesterday off, my wife and I, partially for the feast day, and then just also because we could schedule my in-laws being around. So I just said I'll work Saturday. So
okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah. So just, this is more of like a kind of a curiosity question. In one of your lectures online, I can't remember which one it is, and actually I couldn't find it, but you mentioned, because there's this whole debate, between Bouillard and Lagrange about a development of doctrine, but you mentioned that there's a couple Dominicans that come out like kind of later on with an article that kind of parses apart the intricacies and kind of come to a sort of an agreement. Do you remember that? I couldn't find it.
You're giving a kinder interpretation, but I'll be very careful. It's like, as I say now, all glory, laud, and honor to Dr. John Kerwin, because it was interaction with him working on a volume that he had.
I see.
He had kind of gathered. We had to change it a bit in the middle because our toes got stepped on by someone else who translated some stuff, but which didn't get stepped on. It's just the nature of things, right? Someone beat us to the punch. But so he had, though, outlined sort of the structure of this argument, and then we ended up working together, though, on it, because I did bring some of the expertise in the older scholasticism, and then translating experience too.
I see.
But I mean, I want to make sure that this narrative gets attached to his name just as much, right? Like, out of justice. Like, I want to make sure that it's not just the Meinrad narrative. It really is. There's a folder that is the Kerwin Meinrad folder on my computer, and it's something like that with CUA Press. Like, they have this is something hopefully to come out next year. Everything takes long. We'd hoped it would be out this year, but it's in their pipeline. So bearing that in mind, it's actually at the exact same time. So just quick backstory. During World War II, a guy named Henri Boyard, that we don't talk about, writes a dissertation at the end of which he makes some pretty stark claims about doctrinal development, such that it really does sound like, for instance, he says it pretty openly, what the Council of Trent said about grace using the notion of formal causality is really kind of a passé notion. Formal causality is just this thing that comes from Aristotelianism. And so the Council of Trent, against a certain vein in Protestant soteriology and the theology of grace, holds that we're holy by Christ's holiness, but it's not something that intrinsically changes us. And the council declares, no, we have to claim that grace is the formal cause of our justification because we are divinized. Okay, so Boyard says, well, this use of formal causality, you could put a different notion in there. Now, Garrigou, he says some pretty strong things like that as well. Father Garrigou-Lagrange and some younger Dominicans at the Revue Thomiste read this then and think, holy moly. So then all the notions will change. I mean, do you really mean that? Like the content of the dogma will change. And Boyard thinks that he's got a kind of schema that he thinks is going to maintain this, that the affirmation is the same, but the notions change. That there's a whole theory of judgment that's different there, that the Thomists just don't see how you can talk about an affirmation without talking about what the content of the affirmation is. So at almost exactly the same time, the younger guys at the Revue Thomiste, especially Father Labordette, whom I've mentioned, he's reading as the editor of a periodical. He's getting the issues of two different Jesuit series of books, Sources Chrétiennes, Christian Sources. It's these republications of the fathers at that time, mostly Greek fathers, trying to give to the French reading public the texts that aren't as much in the vogue in the Roman Catholic world there. And also a series called Theologici, in which the first volume of which is Boyard's book.
Yeah.
So after the first 10 volumes come out, he pens an article, Father Labordette, about the promise and problems of these series because they seem anti-scholastic, and also too, he tries to be careful, but he says, the Boyard article is a great example of where this seems to be undergirded by a really bad epistemology. At the same time, Garrigou writes the famous Le Nouvelle Théologie où va-t-elle? Where is the new theology leading us, or where is the new theology going? Right? Is some translated whither the new theology, but where is it going? Where is it going? And it's, although people think that it's kind of tied up with de Lubac and others, the de Lubac stuff is actually...
it's mainly Boyard.
It's Boyard, yeah. The de Lubac stuff is actually more in the Labordette sequence, because there's a set of back and forth, an anonymous thing that's penned by de Lubac that Labordette, the Dominican, writes back to in a rage. And I mean, it's a measured rage, though. That's the thing. It's actually like bending over backwards to be kind. Garrigou, though, is particularly worked up with the Boyard stuff about development of doctrine and the people who are defending him. And he sees in it almost immediately, and it is probably there underneath the surface, actually. He smells the French Catholic philosopher Maurice Blondel and Maurice Blondel's theory of what truth is, that speculative truth, right? Moral truth is different. Moral truth, even for Garrigou, is different because of the way that prudence helps us make a choice that may be completely unique to us, but it still must be virtuous and based in reality. But you have to deal with that kind of combined set of factors that are there. But speculative truth is ultimately about articulating what reality is. Thomists talk about this as adequation to the thing, or adequation to reality. Well, there's a line that Maurice Blondel doesn't seem to ever lose in his writing, where he says that it's about adequation of the mind, equaling of the mind and life. And this sounds, there's a lot of protest against this by theologians over the decades. This sounds like a kind of pragmatic view of the truth, right? The best truth is the one that helps us navigate living, right? It jives with the human possibilities of life. So there's, whether or not that's the only source for the theory of truth that's underneath the hood of Boyard, there's perhaps some other sources as well. Something from Bergson, actually, as well. There's something very Bergsonian too to the theory of truth. Garrigou just starts pounding his fist in a 6 or 7 article series about how this theory of truth is going to take you right back to modernism.
Yeah.
And it's because he says it in that language, it causes the uproar. The young guys, even at the Revue Thomiste, refuse to younger guys. I guess they're in their 40s. As someone who's going to be seeing 40 relatively soon in a couple of years, I mean, I can't call myself young anymore. But Father Labradette doesn't want to publish it because he makes the modernist charge. And he says, it's like, everybody is against us right now because of World War II. They all think that they're treating us like we were just a bunch of collaborators. We weren't sufficiently, resistance. This is even why, like, as a kind of rhetorical move, they get the younger Dominicans get one of their own number, who was the main preacher for the resistance, to write the beginning of a volume, like to do the intro, to try to get like the goodwill of the public, to see that if Father Brooke-Berger can agree with us, this is not merely just a kind of conservative reaction that leads to totalitarianism by 3 steps or something.
Yeah.
But Garrigou, he's actually correct. Like Boyard, if it could have stayed there and it was just about Boyard, Boyard's theory of truth really is a kind of modernist view of theological truth. There's no way to articulate that theory of truth without basically making dogmas change intrinsically.
Yeah,
Dr.
What
Meyer, it comes down to is, go ahead.
Can I just interject something right here? Because I was rereading Father Garrigou's Uvatel, but I was also at the same time reading Ratzinger's his eschatology volume. And I brought it with me because I got to a quote in the appendix, and it shocked me because it sounded exactly like what Father Garrigou was saying.
Give me the page too as you get it, because I'll get my copy right here.
Yeah,
I have an older copy there, blue, but it's UA Press. Okay.
Now, it's page 245, but I have thought more about it, and I actually think he's not saying the exact same thing, because he sound like so maybe I'll just read it and it'll make sense. He says here he's talking. There's a controversy over the word soul. He says the church's teaching. This is the bottom paragraph on 245. The church's teaching office has hereby entered into a theological debate, which it sees as touching the limits of theology. The dismantling of the concept of the soul, which in the course of the last half century has become more and more apparent, is not just a matter for scholars to discuss. Here, the linguistic substrate of faith's fundamental language is en jeu, right, at play. That boundary point has been reached where, over and above the question of the interpretation, the loss threatens the interpretandum, the objective content itself. And so I read that and I was like, whoa, that sounds a lot like Father Lagrange.
It is concerned without having sort of the scholastic idiom, with the idea that, listen, there's a fundamental interpretation, so to speak, which is the articulation of the interpretandum, the thing to be interpreted.
That's right. Yeah. Well, and one last thing. Sorry.
Let's look at the other page.
Okay.
Go to the other page first. Just then you can tell me what you realize, because I want to back you up. So it's on page. I have this highlighted from many years ago when I took a class as an undergraduate. So bottom of that long paragraph on 244. On 244. 244. Yeah.
Okay.
On the one hand, theology must research, discuss, and experiment. Like, even so, the Toulouse guys say this, right? That, like,
I highlighted.
Yeah, it's like right there. It's all orange for me.
Yeah.
So, and the young guys make this point. Brooke-Berger says this. He says, "Listen, we don't have labs that we experiment in. We have to debate, right? The dialogos is where this happens. So there's a kind of working out of theological ideas." But he continues. On the other hand, theology cannot thus create for itself its own object, being ever thrown back, or theology is forever thrown back as it is onto the essence of faith, the faith of the church. To penetrate and develop this essence, rather than to change or replace it, is theology's task. And in truth, with such a task to perform, theology has work enough to do. And although, it's like, although the idiom is different, right? Because he didn't have the same scholastic training. It's this problem of, there's a point at which you can't keep interpreting the whole way down, Like ultimately,
Yeah.
you have to articulate a notion. You're articulating a content, the objective content of what is revealed. And to just say that notions can kind of be changed out for affirmations that stay the same,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
what in the world are these affirmations? And that's why Garrigou and Labradette, in a much more muted way, makes this point. He's like, there's a Bergsonian in the case of Labradette, or there's a Blondelian view of uh, knowledge that is really polluting things here.
Yeah. So, and to kind of balance this out, I also, I mean, I was reading, how to say this without getting in trouble. I was reading Lefebvre's biography, Holy Man, wonderful bishop, and but he says at one point, what is it? Is like être romain, c'est être catholique. Like to be Roman is to be Catholic. There was this kind of like this. Well, I have to find the book.
I fear as an Easterner that sentence went the other way around. No, I do think. I mean, I think he
Yes.
was a holy man who was faced with what was the tragic deconstruction of the Roman Rite,
Yes.
and the theological
Yes.
madness. And I think that sort of retroactively reading into him all sorts of things negatively and making him someone who can't be touched is a real tragedy. I mean, I know someone who said to me, who's no traditionalist.
Yeah.
He had bad experiences in the '80s as a priest.
Yeah.
No, I shouldn't say that. Let me back that up because I have to be careful what I say in public, and I don't want to. He didn't have bad experiences. I mean, he had, but he experienced the gamut of some of the mixed stuff, right? But he has there's a dear place in his heart for so many of those people. So let me be very careful, just in case anyone would ever put this together, because I don't want to make it sound like that. But so he's experienced sort of the closed world that traditionalism can also become. So he's at least nuanced in his awareness of it. Like he's not like a partisan. He said Lefebvre is like one of the great missionaries of the 20th century.
Oh my goodness. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And let alone looking at him as a holy man who watched the dismantling of the faith.
Yeah.
Brooke Berger would make this point even after Father Brooke Berger died as a Dominican, but he sort of broke his vow. Not sort of, he broke his vow of chastity, lived in Greece for a while, eventually did come back, but he was like writing on religion for the Parisian
Yeah.
public. And he wrote against the French
Yeah.
episcopate. He said, you're all a bunch of cowards, but
Mhm.
at least this guy has the cojones
Yeah. Yeah.
to defend the faith,
Yeah.
referring to Lefebvre.
Yeah.
So I want to be clear there, but I always
Yeah.
fear that there's a certain Roman side that's going to be like, to be Catholic is to be Roman.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like no
So
salvation outside of Thomism, or
yeah, right,
exactly.
yeah, that was like the point of the thing with
Yeah.
Timothy, yeah. But so where were we going there? So now let's get ourselves there. I just wanted to
Okay.
us bantering.
Yeah. Well, so to bring it back to Father Garrigou, so I can't help but bring up all these other kind of side polemical issues as well.
That fight was important though, because that's what you were getting at, even
Okay.
back one step further, roping us in here. The polemics of that, the downfall when the Jesuits sanctioned a bunch of the Jesuit authors of the period,
Mhm.
and a lot of that was an internal process. I mean, if there was agitating by Garrigou, there was also a lot of agitation within just the order itself.
I see.
They just pulled people just sort of to keep rum off their back.
Yeah.
Humani Generis is promulgated, and while
Yeah.
some people will say, well, it doesn't condemn,
Yeah.
it doesn't condemn de Lubac and others, it
Booyah
gets to
or
the
de Lubac,
Booyah,
yeah.
exactly. It gets to the fringes of it
Yeah.
at least, and so everyone's tingling in the 50s, right? And they feel persecuted,
Yeah.
and they are
Yeah.
sort of on the outs. And then, like so many tragic things, there's the swing at Vatican II, which
Yeah.
really is sad. Like
Yeah.
I had a very nice conversation with Larry Chapp, right? And I think very highly of Larry. Some people always say like my friend.
I had him on the show actually. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Yeah, he's just a great guy. People say my friend. I just don't talk to him a lot, so I don't want to like friend. I need the word
Yeah.
friend to be people at least I'm talking with a lot, but we get along
Right.
very warmly.
Right.
And at one point we talked about
Yeah.
the council. I was quite willing to defend the orthodoxy of the council, but I made a point that I think it surprised him, and I think he may have got nervous for a second because he thought there was a trad roar coming up out of my soul. They really did.
Yeah.
The young guys who were
Yeah.
reacting to what happened in the 50s, they acted out in a
Mhm.
way that was I think tragically unchristian at times. The example of it was that I tend to come back to is that bit where they start clapping whenever Cardinal Ottaviani, the head of the Holy Office, his microphone gives out. and they're clapping that he can't talk anymore. Well, I especially given that they're not clapping against heresy going out or something, right? Like that's about the only place that's justified. So now you have this swing that is, you people persecuted us, and then it ends up being the development of a narrative, kind of like the post-conciliar boot on the neck. This is why I still to this day, and I'll get myself in trouble someday, no doubt, I get very mad at Bishop Barron for being as orthodox of a man as he is. I don't have sort of the hang-ups on him that some people do. I mean, I don't really care all that much about that one book by Balthasar. It's probably part of the reason why I don't get so worked up, because it's just this one book. I'm like,
Which
the No Salvation Outside the Church,
the one on
because that's what
hell.
everyone gets worked up at Barron about that. And like, I'm like, I mean, I get more angry at the thing. It's closer to my expertise. He talks about preconciliar ahistorical Thomism versus the dynamism of the Communios school. That's this horrible boot on the neck. We are the ascendant conservatives because we happen to publish through Ignatius all of this, Ratzinger, de Lubac, Balthasar, etc. And I have all the Ratzinger. I gladly and warmly pulled it off the shelf. We owe a great debt to Father Fessio and his work. I also tire of the half-truths, right? And so we've lived in a period that finally we're starting to look back at these debates. I'll own the excesses of my side, but now let's own the excesses of the other side.
Yeah.
Because otherwise we're going to be firing at each other's heads. Yeah.
No, honestly, the more I delve deep into the sources, the more I'm realizing that the traditionalist narrative, the more kind of uber communio narrative, like all of these narratives break down, the more I get to the sources, like all of them, which is why I think we need to have you're right, a new conversation that takes into account all the details. Now that we have that kind of hindsight view, and we're away from the heated, back and forth. That's why I love what you and Dr. Declue are doing, which is, you have the Thomas and the Communio people talking.
Yeah.
Personally, I find Ratzinger to be, at least he fits my temperament. Like I find him to be a good balance, and he approaches things. I'm not saying he's perfect. I'm not saying anyone's perfect.
Sure, no. I loved. I mean, Ratzinger is what made me fall in love with theology.
Yes, same.
So that's Ratzinger was very important for me. I mean, I've lived in a kind of Thomist world, but there's something wonderful, like what we just read. It doesn't have kind of the party spirit of a kind of scholastic articulation.
That's right.
So that honesty that's there. I mean, that actually is very refreshing for me to see. Is that kind of honesty that isn't.
He's brutally honest in many directions. Yeah.
So
absolutely.
And it's this. We live in a great era of long form. These discussions take long form discussions, right, to get beyond a kind of narrative.
Yes.
And we live in the world of just where does the conversation go? Because then we can have this discussion.
No,
so
absolutely.
I mean, I think that we're in a good era with the technology
to
be able to also have these discussions. Yeah.
Absolutely. So you brought this up quickly. I wanted to kind of focus on it, and I'm genuinely curious. What is Father Lagrange's position or spectrum of ideas when it comes to no salvation outside the Catholic Church? Where does he stand in all of that messy conversation?
Oh, I mean, basically, in line with like what you're going to find in the end, like that bit from Pius IX, right? I mean, there's of course the possibility. It's not hyper articulated, but there's of course there's the possibility of implicit faith that is had outside the bounds of the church. Now it's probably more delimited for him, right? I think today we're much more willing to consider kind of atheists of good faith, even in the midst of a post-Christian world. Like we're like really giving that way, right?
Yeah.
Ultimately, he doesn't. I'm trying to think if he works this through or not. I mean, ultimately, that implicit faith, which is quite perilous because it doesn't have the objective content to really ground it very well, has to, in some sense, be akin to the desire for baptism.
Yeah.
But he doesn't go much further. If he even goes that far, he's not going to go much further. But that's sort of the key to seeing this, is that it's the same elan of grace working itself out in voto, in desire of baptism,
that's
in voto
right.
baptismi. He doesn't really, it's like in De Revelatione, he deals with it a little bit. He doesn't kind of even get deep into the details. So he tends to cite stuff out of Billiard the French commentator from the 18th century, John of St. Thomas, and Aquinas himself.
Yeah.
And, a lot of those Thomists tend to think like, if this happens, God's going to send an angel, to teach them if they're in the wilds, I mean, so it's a
Yeah.
little bit underdeveloped. But Maritain wrote some interesting stuff on this that's in the range of reason that Labradette and Nicola actually take as being, at least on its, kind of on the whole, meriting a pretty good place for thinking this through. You have to kind of develop it a bit theologically, though, to deal with the problem of how this implicitly is incorporative into the church.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole host of other things. Like Garrigou's just not interested in ecumenism.
Yeah.
Right. That's the other side of this. That's the other issue, is to deal with the ecumenical problem as well, though, of the state of believers outside the church. And it's just not as much his issue. I mean, he'll just be way less sanguine. I mean, listen, there's room. We've had 60 or 70 years of discussion that has been fruitful, more or less, but we're at impasses everywhere.
Yeah.
Right. In Eastern Eastern Catholic and Orthodox debates or discussions. In the Protestant world, it's become so liberalized in some quarters that, like, we've reached a point where, we do have to admit now, like, you have to either, for the sake of, families listening to this podcast, defecate or get off the pot. Like, so, but that's that kind of the ecumenical side of this, which is an issue too, is just sort of not his focus. But so, it's like the possibility of living in a state of faith outside the church is there, but I mean, it's a very narrow band.
Okay.
Very narrow band.
Right. Okay, I was just curious about that. Yeah.
Because he talks about Protestants of good faith on occasion, but he just doesn't delve.
Yeah.
He just doesn't delve.
Yeah.
Because he has to deal with the problem of how could they assent to truths of faith and have supernatural faith, even though they're taught something that's false. Right. So they reject, what they're really rejecting is the authority of their teacher, but they're not actually rejecting, God's revelation by way of faith.
I see.
But I mean, he doesn't deal 1 ounce more with all the problems of epistemology then that are there. He just leaves it there as a possibility.
Yeah.
And, I would just say then, and let's not be overly positive at the boundaries being really broad for him. They're pretty narrow, though. Like, convert.
Okay.
Convert. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, let's see. Maybe we could recap on his legacy, really, and why he would be relevant to us today, and why we should read him.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah. So Father Garrigou-Lagrange's legacy, I think, can be seen most in thinkers like, there are other more minor thinkers, but folks we would know of, the philosophical and like somewhat theological thought of Jacques Maritain, the thought of Father Jean-Hervé Nicolas, whose works are coming into English. I'm translating that stuff because of a kind bequest given by Archbishop Vigneron to the Thomas Institute.
Great.
So and they're just on their way out. I mean, they're kind of drafted, but they're just in the pipeline. So the Christology volume will be coming out late this year.
Wonderful.
The works of Labradette, and then there's like kind of a broader diffusion of people who studied under him, or were very amenable to him. So like people who in spiritual theology were affected by the work of Father Jordan Amen are pretty close to Garrigou's line, even though Amen was more of a Juan Arentero guy. It's all the same line. It's the big line of mystical theology and spiritual theology. And so, the sort of more diffuse, like remnants. Cardinal Journet as well was influenced pretty deeply by him. And of course, we could probably, like I said, we could come up with a whole host of Dominicans who then have echoes of him all throughout, right? So Nicola teaches forever, and there are echoes that go all throughout, and Labradette teaches for decades, and there are echoes of him that go throughout various figures. And so, how can he help us today? How can reading his works today be of use? I think that in the end, seeing how a traditional Thomism, answering questions of its own era that aren't, going to all be the same questions of today, but still are real questions. A traditional Thomism deployed itself in the service of the church, in a way that even if it's pretty quintessentially Western in its idiom, it's pretty scholastic in its idiom, answered all sorts of issues in theological methodology, in spirituality, in metaphysics, especially. He had a real metaphysical mind. Uh, to learn, like learn by watching someone do it. Right? This is a man who had a worldview. So I love Ratzinger. Ratzinger is much more idiosyncratic, right? In the sense that like his own brilliant synthesis is in him in a sense, right? There's not a tradition he's coming out of. He's more like trying to live in the tradition. But to try to get a feel for, what is the mode of thinking within a tradition, and it happens to be a tradition that I think has a lot of explanatory power. Even as an Easterner, I think it has a ton of explanatory power. There are lots of things about Thomist spirituality that actually could be put right next door to hesychasm, actually. Different practices, but the deep bones are quite close, actually. So, to learn what it's like to be in a tradition and yet also thinking through the problems of your age, like you have to engage with it sometimes, hear the voice of someone, right? Like, hear the voice of them, learn how they did it, watch them do it, just by digesting their works. And then you sort of internalize a temperament that then teaches you to do something that's quite anti-modern, right? Modernity is based in so many ways for centuries and centuries upon a kind of rejection of the past. It continues to be the narrative of there was nothing before the modern period. Like that still rules a kind of founding myth in people's thought, and we don't realize it, how often it's the case. It's just as much a problem for like those who would even inherit from the Communio school, right? It's like these people wrote coming out of a tradition, right? And I think that just sort of learning how to think within a tradition, and then a tradition that I think is theologically powerful in its own way, is something that he just offers for Catholic thinkers today, to try to think about how can we at once be, the Nova at the Vetera, right? The old, or the Vetera at the Nova, the old and the new. And then you learn from him, and then you see his students and those affected by him. You can read, you then can read someone like a Journet or a Nicola, who are right at the interstices of the council, and how they did the same thing. Or someone like Duranzo, who's it's a little bit different, a little bit more like technical, it's all in Latin. Or the quirky Woodbury. I've never even mentioned Father Woodbury. Austin Woodbury, you can find his notes online. He taught at Sydney, this master's course in scholasticism, incredibly technical scholasticism, but he could draw 250 people to come to these lectures.
Wow.
He was kind of like an autistic savant. He was a bit on the spectrum from what I understand, but he
Yeah.
lectured in a way that was just transfixing. He'd wear a white lab coat over his clerics because he'd get so chalk covered. Yeah. And he wrote these highly outlined, schematized, you would think very scholastic, like,
Yeah.
hyper schematized notes that he would lecture off of.
Hmm.
And yet, he was integrating really, like in his case, as a philosophical mind, in his critical metaphysics, a wonderful response to late modern epistemological stuff, that was within the tradition, but answering a certain milieu of Anglophonic philosophy of his time. Quite brilliant stuff, actually. But all of these give us then like a way of learning how to be in a tradition and to answer the problems of the day. So to learn to be a disciple of the school of Thomas, though, as well. I mean, to be very clear, this isn't merely just learn how to do theology in a tradition. To learn how to be a Thomist within the school of the traditional school of Thomism is a lesson to be learned from Father Garrigou.
Gotcha. So to kind of to close us out, first, before I ask you where the audience can find you, do you have any like upcoming projects or translations or publications that you want the audience to know about?
Yeah, the 2-volume series of De Revelazione is coming out. It's a little bit expensive, but if you go to Ascension, or not Ascension, sorry, I'm so used to doing these bits for my moral theology book made by God, made for God. They like drilled into me to go to ascensionpress.com/Catholic morality. But go to the St. Paul Center, for crying out loud, the Emmaus Academic. If you look up there, I think they're selling the 2 volumes together for discount. So there's that, and there's also a volume coming out from CUA Press that I think incredibly highly of, called The True Christian Life. The True Christian Life by Father Ambrose Gardet. It's a great digest of many themes about like moral theology and divinization that are very Garrigouvian, or there's a sense in which Garrigou is also very Gardayian, or it's in which they're both they're both coming from the same tradition. It's a very powerful book of moral theology, The True Christian Life.
Wonderful. Awesome.
So
And so where can the audience find out more about your lectures, your work? Do you have a website? All that kind of stuff.
yeah, so if you go to philosophicalcatholic.com, so all one word, philosophicalcatholic.com, you can drop into my profile page and see various books and lectures and some of my academic writing as well.
Wonderful. Dr. Meyer, this was a extremely interesting conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on the Logos Project. Audience, I hope you enjoy this conversation. And if you enjoyed this content, leave us a review. You can support us on patreon.com/the Logos Project. And without further ado, we'll say goodbye.
Thank you very much.